This week, America's freight railroads lost a court battle over something you may not have even realized they were fighting about. How many people does it take to operate a freight train? On Tuesday, August 11th, 2026, a federal appeals court upheld a Federal Railroad Administration rule that generally requires freight trains to operate with at least two crew members. The railroads wanted that rule thrown out. And there's actually a pretty fascinating reason why. Because a modern freight train can be 2 or even 3 miles long. It can weigh thousands upon thousands of tons. It may be carrying hazardous materials, and yet the entire thing may be operated by just two people. So, what exactly are both of them doing? And more importantly, could the railroad get rid of one of them? My name is Mark Magana, and this is Railroad Economics, where we talk about the business behind the trains. Most freight trains today have two crew members, a locomotive engineer and a conductor. And here's something that probably confuses a lot of people: the conductor isn't the person driving the train, that's the engineer. And for some reason, a lot of people think the conductor drives the train. I don't know why that is, but it is the engineer. The locomotive engineer performs nearly all of the actions that actually control the movement of the train: the throttle, the brakes, the speed, all that stuff. Actually running the locomotive. That's the engineer's job. The conductor has a different job. Under federal regulations, the conductor is essentially the crew member in charge of the train or yard crew. The conductor helps manage the train itself, coordinates with the engineer, communicates with dispatchers and other railroad employees, keeps track of the train consist, and deals with unusual situations along the way. And that last part is where this gets very interesting because let's imagine you're running a 10,000-foot freight train through the middle of nowhere. 10,000 feet's almost 2 miles. Everything is going wonderfully until clunk. Something happens 7,000 feet behind you, over a mile behind you. Something happens. Maybe you've got a broken knuckle. Maybe an air hose came apart. Maybe something needs to be inspected. Maybe the train is somehow disabled. With two people in the locomotive, the engineer can remain with the controls while the conductor gets out and deals with the problem. With one person, with only one person on the whole train, well, congratulations, engineer. You get to go for a walk. And mechanical problems aren't the only argument for having the second person. The FRA says a second crew member can provide another set of eyes and another layer of protection against human error. They can communicate with dispatchers or roadway workers while the engineer concentrates on operating the train. They can help troubleshoot problems. And if something much more serious happens, a derailment, a hazardous material release, an emergency at a blocked grade crossing, or even a medical emergency involving the engineer, having another qualified railroad employee already on the train could suddenly become extremely important. And modern technology hasn't completely eliminated those jobs. Positive Train Control, or PTC, is an incredibly sophisticated safety system. Among other things, it's designed to prevent certain train to train collisions, overspeed derailments, unauthorized movements in the work zones, and movements through switches in the wrong position. But PTC isn't a robotic computerized conductor. The FRA specifically concluded that there are safety functions performed by a conductor that PTC does not perform. PTC can't climb down from the locomotive and inspect the 86th car. PTC can't replace an air hose. It can't walk back and throw a handbrake. and it can't physically respond to an emergency happening somewhere along a train that may be almost 3 miles long. So, from the safety side of the argument, keeping two people aboard trains seems pretty straightforward, seems to make sense. But the railroads themselves have a pretty compelling argument of their own. At least they feel like they do. Because the question isn't whether having another person on board, another employee, can be useful. Of course it can. The question is whether every train should be legally required to have that second person, regardless of whether technology and operating conditions might make it unnecessary. The Association of American Railroads argues that there simply isn't convincing statistical evidence proving that two-person crews are inherently safer than one-person crews. And this isn't an argument they just came up with yesterday. In fact, this entire issue has bounced back and forth inside the federal government for years. The FRA considered a two-person requirement years ago. Then, back in 2019, the agency withdrew the effort after concluding that the available evidence wasn't sufficient to justify nationwide crew regulation. Several years later, the FRA reconsidered. The agency pointed to things including increasingly long freight trains, increases in human factor related accidents, uncertainty surrounding new technologies, and testimony from railroad workers about situations where second crew members had helped prevent or respond to an accident. And in 2024, the FRA issued the rule that is now the center of this court case. In general, it establishes two people as the minimum crew size. But here's an important detail: the rule does not mean that a one person train can never exist. Some existing operations are exempt. Certain Class 2 and Class 3 railroads can use a notification process for qualifying one person operations, and other railroads can apply for special approval. But if a railroad wants FRA approval for a new one person operation, it may have to provide a detailed risk assessment and demonstrate that the proposed operation will be, quote, as safe or safer than, end quote, a complete two-person operation. And now we get to the real fight. Of course, the economics of the matter, the money. Imagine you're a major railroad operating thousands of trains. Removing one person from a train crew isn't just saving one employee's salary, it's potentially eliminating an enormous amount of labor expense across the entire railroad. Wages, benefits, training, crew scheduling, transportation, hotels, retirement costs, and all the infrastructure required to support another group of employees moving around the nationwide rail network. So, if technology eventually allows one person to perform the job safely, the economic incentive to reduce crew size is enormous. And the railroads argue that a government rule requiring two people could freeze an old labor model in place even as technology improves. They also point to one person railroad operations that already exist in the United States. In other words, the railroad's argument isn't necessarily, quote, we don't need conductors, end quote. It's, please don't make us legally promise that we'll need conductors forever. And that makes this argument about something much bigger than the second seat inside a locomotive cab. It's really a fight over automation. Railroads have already spent billions of dollars installing technology like positive train control. Remote control locomotives have been used in railroad yards for years. Computers increasingly monitor locomotives, track conditions, and train operations. So once technology eliminates enough tasks, at what point does a two-person crew become a one-person crew? And eventually, could a one-person crew become nobody at all? We're obviously not there yet on American mainline freight trains, but that's the direction this debate is ultimately pointing to. And this week, the railroads suffered a major setback. Six railroads, including Union Pacific and BNSF, along with the Association of American Railroads and the American Shortline and Regional Railroad Association, challenged the FRA rule in federal court. On August 11th, 2026, the U.S. Court of Appeals of the 11th Circuit rejected their challenge in a divided 2-to-1 decision. The majority concluded that the FRA had the legal authority to establish the crew size rule and had adequately justified its decision. But the dissenting judge strongly disagreed. Among other things, she argued that FRA had not sufficiently explained why evidence it once considered inadequate suddenly justified a two-person requirement. She also criticized the agency's cost benefit analysis for not accounting for future labor costs that railroads could incur by being prevented from reducing crew sizes. So even the judges couldn't completely agree on this one. And that's probably appropriate because there really are two different questions here. Can a freight train physically be operated by one person? Clearly, yes. There are already railroad operations that do exactly that. But is one person enough when something goes wrong on a 2 mile freight train carrying thousands of tons of cargo through communities across America? That's much harder to answer. For now, federal regulators have essentially said if the railroad wants to remove that second person, it's the railroad's job to prove that doing so is just as safe, if not safer. And after this week's court decision, well, that rule is staying in place. So what is my opinion? Not that it counts or matters, but trains go through some really desolate parts of our country. I don't think I'd want to be operating a train all alone. Not that I'm an engineer or a conductor or in any way any kind of railroad employee. I'm not, but that just seems scary if something's going wrong. Just this past week in California, there was a train robbery. I will cover it in a future episode coming up shortly, but train robberies are still a thing. Would you want to be all by yourself in the middle of nowhere when there's a train robbery if you're a railroad employee? Can you imagine stopping the train, getting out to seeing what's wrong, and there's bad guys out there, and there's nobody left in the locomotive to call for help? Scary stuff. Very scary stuff. This has been Railroad Economics. My name is Mark Magana. Please like, subscribe, do the things, and thank you so much for watching.